All right. Well, yeah, thank you all for coming to Be Better Club. So today we're going to be doing the second to last session on democracy. So we did the democracy theme this term because of the election, of course. And so today we're going to be talking about the question of well, how widely we should want the voting pool to be, essentially. And so there's this debate, especially in political science, political theory, with respect to the question of, so we have misinformed or maybe ignorant voters. Is the response to that to restrict the vote or create certain requirements, voting tests, things like that ensure only the educated are voting? Or ought we to try and actually maximize the number of voters, even require voting as a way of giving people the motivation and the incentive to improve their skills or their abilities such that they become capable voters? It's a little more complicated than that, of course, because there's also this idea that even if they don't become, as you heard in the podcast, if you had a chance to listen to it, even if they don't become more educated, there's this idea that the group itself has a sort of wisdom to it, such that actually having more participation leads to better outcomes. And so I don't know how many folks had a chance to listen to the podcast. Of course, no worries if we did, but I just don't want to depend on too much. Did y'all, I know Alex, you said you did. Did other folks have a chance to listen to it?
Yes, I did.
Okay. So I'll say a little bit of a recap. Basically, the debate or the discussion that is explored in the podcast, and I really encourage y'all, a lot of things on our plate, but if you get a chance, it's a great one, is the idea of, how do we respond to the fact that maybe it seems like the outcomes we're getting in democracies aren't the outcomes that we would understand as rational or good or effective? What's the reply to that? And the two main schools of thought that are considered here is one, echoed by Jason Brennan in particular. He's a sort of libertarian political theorist. He suggests, or he's in favor of this system called epistocracy, with the idea that we shouldn't aim to have everybody to vote, or everyone in a democracy have a say. In fact, he thinks if we want good decisions, in particular, if we want decisions that realize, there's openness there, but certain good ends for us, it's going to be better to think about different ways of modifying how elections happen. And he considers several there. We can talk about those as it comes up. On the other hand, we have, in particular, she's from University of Political Scientists, I think, in Australia, whose name has just dropped out of my mind. So her suggestion is, especially based on the case in Australia where they have compulsory voting, but many other countries do this as well, that actually having a requirement to vote leads to better outcomes. And part of this has to do with the fact that the people who are voting in systems where it's not required are often particularly partisan. They have particular biases and so forth. This is a thing that both actually interesting, her and Brennan agree on, but how they think we should respond to that, what outcomes are going to lead us to get the ends we want, differ. But the main question, I guess, is, what if folks did have a chance, like Stephen, thoughts that came up or points of discussion that we want to get started on, and then just Dan, because we knew we essentially start a discussion. They sometimes jump in to try and lead us certain ways, but pretty much it's still the group's discussion. So whatever we want to chat about is great.
Okay, may I jump in and ask a question? Because I did read that summation. I didn't get to watch the podcast, but I did see what you had referred to. I was thinking, people call the U.S. a democracy. And is that not a misnomer from what we've always been taught in, social studies and all that? That rather than being a democracy, we're more of a democratic republic? That we don't vote necessarily to make the laws, but we vote to elect the people that make the laws. And how would that modify, or how would that serve to solve the issue, the dilemma that we have?
Yeah. Does anyone want to respond? I think you're right. We're right about the first part at least, and then whether it has an effect is. So I think on technical definition. Oh yeah, Stephen, jump in.
I was just going to say, I think, we are a democracy, even though it's a representative democracy, so it's a special type. And essentially, the people that we vote for are supposedly kind of like Plato's philosopher king. They're the people who are the most knowledgeable about complex issues, and they have convinced us that they know the most and that they will do the right thing for the most people. So, of course, there's all kinds of complexities, social media, propaganda that gets in there, people that convince us they know the most, people that point to facts that are not facts, that are lies. And so, those issues come up. But what are the choices? I mean, I think it's Venezuela that has one person, one vote. Everybody votes, and so it's not representative in the same sense. And I don't think it's worked out all that well for them. So, yeah, we have sort of a hybrid type of democracy, which is a republic, as you said.
I mean, I think, yeah, Steve's right. It doesn't meet, I think, if your technical definition of democracy is direct vote on particular policies, of course, not. I think in some sense, the more interesting, maybe we shouldn't say that. A particularly interesting question for me, right, is whether or not we're a democracy or a republic or representative or, whatever is, given whatever our system is, how it's designed, what is the design of the system? What rules or aims or goals are going to best realize whatever it is we care about? And so two tools I think are relevant. One is the instrumentalist orientation, which is the one that Brennan has. Is the purpose of the system, is its outcomes or how we evaluate it just in how things turn out? Do we get good leaders who lead to good policies, blah, blah, blah? Or, and this is often common with the folks who, in this case, argue for compulsory voting or trying to expand the voting pool. Is there something in addition, maybe procedurally good or fair about having this process? So even if maybe, of course we should have Dan make our decisions for the group because he's going to make the best decisions. Is there something better about a system where all 5 of us have a say or have some weight that should be assessed as well? And so Brennan, an instrumentalist, disagrees, but folks like, and I should find her name, the woman from Australia, Jill Shepherd, that's what it is. Shepherd, she thinks that there seems to be something procedurally good about this, that the very process of our deciding in this way gives it some weight that's valuable to us. They also, I want to be clear, she also thinks this is instrumentalist benefits from compulsory voting and so forth. But all that to say, that was a long-winded. I'm really sorry about that. The thing I'm wondering is like, yeah, how does whatever our system is, how should we be assessing its moral weight or its normative value, right? Is it, in this case, because the discussion is about how much of a large voting pool we have or how we want to respond to the ignorant voter, blah, blah, blah. There, but I think in all the questions we've discussed this term, there's a thought of like, yeah, what ends should we be having in mind or what processes are meritorious or whatever.
So Josh, if I may jump in, I think that, and there's so many critiques of epistocracy, of course, but I think epistocracy is flawed fundamentally in the sense that, sure, like if you've read Jason Brennan's Against Democracy, he has a whole chapter where he talks about why voters are just incapable, of knowing or unwilling to know or have motivated reasoning, why it's irrational, to even spend time thinking, given that your vote doesn't count, things of that nature. And I get that, but it kind of assumes an all-knowingness of whatever the select number of people who either, are able to vote or have higher voting power than everyone else who does not necessarily, know what they need to know to vote. Like there's this assumption that they know everything there is to know. And, obviously this is not right either, right? So sure, I'm not saying that expertise is not important, but everyone, including experts, is biased. Everyone has their own interests, and these kind of influence the way they think about things, and their approach to what problem, prioritizing what needs solving, things of that nature. Then there's the feminist critiques of situated knowledge about whether if we have a group of select people who can vote, are they even, broad enough? And Brennan would say they need to be broad enough to cover every part of society because, you need to have knowledge about what's happening in every part of society and so on and so forth. But there seems to be something essential about the vote in terms of communicating, as one of, among many ways, I guess, to communicate information about what one is prioritizing, what's important, what the difficulties, problems they face, etc. are, that I don't think epistocracy allows for, unless, you know, we keep like thinking of epistocracy very expansive and we keep adding people to that epistocratic few. And at some, you know, at what point do you just reach, you go back to democracy where you need to include everyone anyway, in order to have like accurate information about all these issues. So I'm not fully persuaded about that. Yeah, about that approach.
Is anyone more persuaded, or either? I mean, I have some things to say, but I could talk all day, right? Yeah, Steve.
I once interned for a lawyer for like just 2 weeks, and driving back and forth, we had good conversations. And one of the things he told me was that through his company, you know, that his law firm, he would donate money to the Dems and to the Republicans, equal amount of money. And at the time when he first said it, it struck me as odd that he wouldn't be supporting a position. But he said the reason he does it is to be active in supporting the discussion, the conversations, the function of democracy. And somehow I think that's sage insofar, and might it inform us here that maybe we should focus these kinds of conversations a little bit less on the absolute truth of an outcome. Is democracy successful based on, you know, the outcome of an election and who participates in it? And should it be more about the process and the conversations that lead up to the election, that the process you go through in discussing issues and vetting candidates, and, you know, having them go out into the field and meet voters and discuss issues, that is just as important as the actual vote itself. Certainly if the vote were terrible and we elected bad officials and things went south, you know, that would be a bad outcome. But because you have wide participation, and because that wide participation necessitates an active dialogue, that in and of itself is a manifestation of democracy. And so how we vote, and whether it's first past the polls or some sort of, you know, Irish type system where you do ranked candidates, that might be a little bit more secondary relative to the primary goal of having conversations about issues in the process.
I mean, so, oh yeah, Stephen.
I was just going to say, I think early on, we learn in elementary school, actually, when we pledge allegiance to the flag, you know, that we are citizens and we have certain rights as citizens, but we also have responsibilities, and that is participation in our democracy. And I think we also learn, however, that our democracy is competitive, you know, and in fact, the competition starts right from the beginning. Sometimes you're competing to be, you know, maybe class president or officer or whatever. And you also learn, even with your sports teams, that, yeah, it's competitive. And, but in order for everybody to get the best out of it, you want a level playing field. You want fair rules that everybody observes, and that makes for the best game, I think. And hopefully, by a participatory democracy, understanding the level playing field, understanding the rules, understanding that with rights come responsibilities. Yes, this is something you owe to yourself and to your fellow citizens. I don't know that that's ingrained enough now in our school system. I hope that it is. But the other thing is, not only do you have a right to educate, or the responsibility to educate yourself about important matters, knowing that your fellow citizen also has a vote and his responsibility, you should see that it is somewhat your responsibility to encourage him to also get educated, to be informed, because his vote affects your life as well as you affecting his. And so that's part of democracy as well. You know, seeing or trying to encourage informed citizenry. That doesn't always work in a highly competitive society, I think, where, you know, In some areas, maybe you wish he wasn't so well informed so that you could outcompete him. You know, that's the way the stock market works, right? So there's winners and losers. But yeah, I think the public education system kind of observes this as, yes, we need to have all of our children properly educated and informed as citizens. Now, part of the problem now, of course, is we have these polarized forces trying to get involved, trying to push their agenda in the schools. And that's all the way from the bottom to the top, rather than having I guess I would call it, a liberal education where your most important education has to do with proper discernment of facts, the true fact. What is the truth? And then go from there. So I'll just throw that out for hopefully somebody will pick that up.
Yeah, so I'm hearing pretty stable agreement with the sort of shepherd. Voting is good. It's more than an instrumental. So I'm gonna play Brennan pretty hard today, I think, to try and put some pressure on this. And so, yeah, I'm hearing it. It sounds like it'd be great. We should be educating ourselves and educating other people. There's something nice about the process. Maybe we're too fixated on outcomes. Let's even grant that there's some weight we give to that. I'm wondering if, like, we look at this. So we have a Trump presidency, or we have a Biden presidency, or we have whoever. I'm sure we're unsatisfied with one of these people, right? You look at these outcomes, you look across the world, there's other elections where it's, again, like, I can't believe this person's winning, or even if they win, I can't believe that second place party was this one. There's all this concern about how things are going. Yeah, the world is deeply polarized. Maybe there's people trying to get, rather than as Steve's lawyer boss who was trying to lead to good discussion, this seems like people are trying to manipulate the populace, blah, blah, blah. In this situation, isn't there a strong force that's just like, look, we need to change something about how the system's running. And if I'm asking myself, I'm seeing, yeah, people saying they're voting for, this I just remember from the podcast. Brennan says people were voting for Al Gore. They knew Al Gore was liberal, but they didn't know what that meant. Or, I remember in the 2020 elections, everybody, so when Biden beat Bernie in a bunch of these states, one of the reasons people like Biden is because they like Medicare for all. And it was just like, well, that's not a Biden policy. And so this sort of reality, the vision, the utopia, it sounds really great. I love democracy, but like, I'm looking at the reality, like, people don't know what they're voting for. They're electing candidates that, from my, of course, I'm the educated one here, right? My perspective seems to be a mistake, right? What kind of response is it? Are we just supposed to say, okay, well, there's costs and benefits. This process is so beneficial, or how can we try and respond to the sort of Brennan concerns that Steve.
Go ahead, Alex. Well, okay. I was just going to say it's a Brennan makes a good point. When the ignorant vote, of course, if they're required to vote, maybe many of them wouldn't vote. They say, well, I don't know the facts. I'm not smart enough, so I don't know what's going on. So I'm not going to vote. But if they're forced to vote, when the ignorant vote, then it can dilute perhaps the people that do know the best. So that is a problem. Here again, it falls back on the best general education that people can get from the bottom to the top, a general fair education with the facts, the best facts, scientific education, but good social arts, all of it, I think, it comes into play. So he points out a good problem. The ignorant do dilute the vote, and that's a problem. But that means more and more that it is each of our responsibility to see that our fellow citizen gets a fair and proper education. It's harder and harder these days, but yeah, okay. So go, Alex.
Yeah, Steve, that's a pretty, I was heading along those lines too. It seems to me that there should always be a priority of not disenfranchising voters, right? So even if all these things are true, and they are, right? There's a lot of social science that talks about the ignorance of voters on which Brennan draws. I don't see why the solution is disenfranchising voters who are ignorant, and who knows what those criteria are, right? And not regulating campaign laws, funding education, making sure that education is, developing critical thinking so people can properly evaluate arguments to see through, attacks on people rather than their ideas, et cetera, right? So there seems to me to be a presumption toward not disenfranchising voters that I don't think that Brennan sees. And I'm not saying, that it's easy to do all those things, right? Curbing campaign finance laws as they are now, which, you all know about the situation. I don't need to tell you, like, even as of late, the amount of millions that, billionaires have been pouring into the elections is just astounding, right? So it just seems to me that there are so many better ways to make sure that these dilutive mechanisms, right, which arguably try to maintain this ignorance and benefit from this ignorance, are just, dissipate, so we can have a more, a better exchange of information that's not influenced by the millions in ad campaigns that are distorting the truth, or by, an education that includes banning books because, they're not flattering to, one particular vision of the country or things of that nature, right? So I think, of course, that's a much longer project. Well, the campaign finance laws, you could just pass that presumably. But it just seems that by giving, into the sophisticratic challenge to democracy, what you end up doing is essentially conceding too much, right? And you don't know where that will take you down the road.
Yeah, people that feel disenfranchised, that feel like society, that they're outliers, that society has pushed them out, or that for whatever reason they're not educated, they're ignorant. They find other ways, of course, to gain some kind of power. And often it may turn out that they turn to crime. They become the pimples of the sore spots of society, and they cause problems. Actually, if they don't feel like they have a place and a role to play in society, then so I completely agree with you. This is again rights and citizenship, responsibilities of citizenship. That's why just trying to push out the people that we feel are unknowledgeable or uneducated, it won't work. It's our responsibility to everything we can to see that they get a proper education through our tax support of school systems, a tax support of all kinds of other things, whether it be citizens groups or whatever, so that they can learn and they can participate. I guess some of the things that get in the way, of course, is our profit system looks to those people who feel disenfranchised and give them an alternative set, what they call alternative facts, that may not be true, and there's a profit motive for going after the disenfranchised and feeding them with bad information, which then they collect and become even more poisonous to society.
Yeah, so actually what's the end of what you were talking about there, Steve, is what we call the legitimacy question, right? So the thought is like, well, if people don't get the vote, are they going to feel like the system doesn't represent them? And when you do, that actually does, it leads to social disorder, leads to distrust. It's bad for society. Unfortunately, or fortunately for me, qua Brennan, there's some good data that actually it's not as big of a problem as we think. And if you look at surveys, people think of the Chinese state as particularly legitimate, even though very undemocratic. The U.S. ranks, I know we're not the most legitimate seeming democracy, but we rank very low on legitimacy. People often distrust the government, even if they believe in democracy and so forth. And so one thought is the data seems to suggest, there's exceptions here, but the data seems to suggest that moves away from a place where everyone votes and blah, 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 doesn't seem to necessitate a real legitimacy crisis. And so look, if we're not going to get these source stats, these pimples of society, I like that analogy, that seems to discuss, because that's definitely one thing that I think does motivate for me, the idea that like, well, even if it's democracies, not a great system, it's the best of all the others. Well, now there seems to be some real tension on this. And then I think I would push that further, like, if I think of what is the point of the state or the government, it seems like saying something like, oh, to serve the people is a good end. And that's an end that now I'm going to make my epistemic argument, pulls away from democracy. It seems like we'll get better outcomes that serve more people, maybe realize better education, blah, 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 blah. If, I don't know, we tweak the voting system in one way or the other. And so just, I don't know how familiar folks are with epistocracy in terms of like the processes people recommend or consider. But Brennan went through a few. So one of them is the idea that maybe everyone does get the vote, but you have some sort of panels or organizations that undo bad votes. Some people understand the Supreme Court in a country is like this. It can just overturn a vote if it doesn't fit some standard. So there's all existing democracies do have some epistemic epistocratic elements. Voting lottery. So like we do jury system, we might rather than having everybody vote, we have a lottery of random people vote, and then those folks in particular, there's a sort of mini public discursive democracy angle here where they suggest we have some limited number of people who get vote by lottery, and then those folks go through an education process. So in some sense, it's maybe like the people, but not everybody. It's less susceptible to the propagandizing, blah, blah, blah. The one that Brennan supports is what he calls government by simulated oracle. And I think it responds to some of the concerns that I certainly in reality have with epistocracy. He suggests we do three things. And then we have a government that's based on this outcome. So first, what you want to do is you want to think about who are these people? So you get some sort of demographic data, I should say. So, okay, this is a white male who's middle class and highly educated. This is a Black woman who's upper class, but only has a college degree, whatever, that sort of thing. So you register these sort of demographic categories. Then you ask people what they want, right? Get a sense of what their goals are. So, I want productivity, I want growth, blah, blah, blah. And then the third, and so yeah, Steve, you listen to this, so this is, but for folks didn't. The third is you ask them some facts about what the system is like. So you try and register their education level, right? And so then it is, maybe me and Steve have the same demographic background. We have the same goals, but Steve knows a bunch of stuff and I don't. And so I say, I want more jobs, better wages for the working class, blah, blah, blah. And so that's why I'm voting for ultra-rich billionaire who doesn't care about me, because I misunderstand something. Where Steve has the same goals, same interests, but actually knows the facts. What we do is then we give people like Steve the vote, essentially. So we have like an election based on where demographic categories are represented, but they're in some sort of educated or benevolent, not benevolent, educated versions of me. So like my informed preferences, rather than my preferences subjected to lack of information, blah, blah, blah. And here the thought is like, look, it is going to seem to serve the people. It might get the results. And we won't have to have the concern that almost all epistocratic systems have, or if you just register what people already know, it's going to be the most privileged people who get the votes, because that's how society works, right? The better educated are the richer. And so in a racist society, they're the whiter, or in a male-dominant society, maybe the male or whatever, right? This simulated oracle idea Brennan offers, he thinks is a way of getting around that problem. So we don't get these racist or sexist or anti-immigrant issues, and we get the sort of good outcomes that he thinks an epistocratic system can realize. So, and maybe if he's right, the legitimacy problem, which is a great objection, isn't going to apply, because people are going to feel like, oh yeah, actually I'm getting the lower crime rates or the increased productivity or whatever that I wanted. Yeah, Alex.
Thanks, Josh. That's helpful to remind these things. So I'll say two things. The one pertains to the legitimacy question, the other to the recommendations you say that Brennan makes. I'll start with the recommendations, because again, it seems to me that at what point, do you like just keep including people to this process to make sure everyone is represented, where the epistocracy is just so I can't think of a good word.
Such wide enfranchisement. There's so many people who are participating in that.
Yeah, it's just so big that essentially it's easier to just essentially include everyone and take measures that enable the processes that we already have in place, many of which Steve was talking about in education focused, to just work properly and not be impeded by bad faith actors. With regard to the legitimacy, I just want to distinguish between.
Can I jump in? I want you to respond. I want to hear the first one. I just want to say, I think this is, first of all, this is what makes it so annoying to argue with for me, the Brennan's for the position. Hey, if we keep expanding it and we get the full democracy, that's great. Because Brennan, am only interested in the outcomes. I'm just an instrumentalist about these. So if, as you mentioned, Jess, we get such a big enfranchisement that it seems like everyone's voting, good. But my question is, whatever the system is, it should be the one that realizes these good outcomes. And so if over time we get back to full democracy, that's great for me. I don't care. I'm not like anti-democracy. I'm just
I think, Josh, that this comes with like a series of problems, such as delegitimizing, liberal education, for instance, that I think we all care about, and Steve was mentioning, right? That education then becomes, what common schools in the US started in order to maintain, citizenry that has a consciousness of the common good and our common values, things of that nature. That goes out the window because not everyone has to vote necessarily. So, education just becomes vocational. And that contributes to potentially a vicious circle where people become more and more ill-informed, right? But then coming back to that legitimacy question, I think the important distinction here that matters is descriptive versus normative legitimacy, right? Because it seems like all these points that you were making were purely about perceptions of legitimacy. They were not about whether it is actually legitimate, as we philosophers, for instance, might consider it to be legitimate, right? So I don't think that the examples that you mentioned are examples of normative legitimacy, and of course that's a whole other conversation we need to talk about. But there's many ways in which you can, manufacture consent and make people feel like they live in a legitimate country, political system, even when it is not. But that's not the standard which I think we should meet in determining whether a system is legitimate to begin with.
Yeah, this is actually really good, and I think this is also. I'll let you in a second, Steve. I think what's good about the point you're just making, I think it does identify something that's going on here. Is sometimes feels like the debate is going past each other, right? I think there's even at what point in the interview where Shepard is like, yeah, honestly, I think if we tried some of Brennan's policies, they probably would get good results. But essentially, that's not all this is about. And so if it feels legitimate, that might stop the problem. If our real concern is, okay, is there going to be pimples of society that we have to evolve? Feeling legitimate is going to be enough to ensure that doesn't happen. But if we think there is something really important about the fact that, yeah, I actually do have a say, not that just some people like me or some folks who share some interest of mine have a say. If we think there's something valuable there, then it seems like democracy as a process becomes important. Or if we think, not just merely we want to create incentives for people to be well educated and have liberal educations, but if we think like there's something good about being the sort of person who's capable of self-management and maybe management of a community together, right? So if we have some sort of really robust, in this sense, Republican conception of the good of shared governance, right? We again might think, yeah, maybe aristocracy gets us better outcomes, but it destroys our virtue. Because now I know I don't need to worry about it. Alex happens to be a weirdo who loves politics and he's going to educate himself and he's going to vote for me and I can trust that. Well, we might think there's something wrong with me in not recognizing, in surrendering my autonomy or surrendering my interest in like this shared project, right? And so these are costs I think. We need to identify what those benefits are and defend them, of course. We need to say it is important that people are like well educated and thinking about how to govern. But once we've identified those and explained why they're justified or not, I think it makes it like the discussion isn't just, as we said earlier, just outcomes. There's like other things at stake here, right? And so that's one way in which I think sometimes the conversation seems to slip past each other on accident. And I'll say Brennan is clearly not committed. He's not moved by any sort of non-instrumentalist outcome for democracy. He says whatever the government is, it's the one that realizes the outcomes that are worth realizing. And he doesn't track or he doesn't register, not that he's wrong or right on this, but he doesn't register some sort of virtue of self-governance or some sort of normative value in having a say or anything as important. But if we do, well, we have to identify that and defend it, and that gives us a reason to think, okay, sorry for that teaching moment, but I think it does maybe help lock us into something that can go on. Yeah, Stephen, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say that except the fact that, first of all, not everybody votes. Not everybody is eligible to vote. So first of all, by age, you have to be 18. And there are certain assumptions about people that reach that age of voting. Typically, they have some type of formal schooling because that is actually required by law. here again, that goes back again to a proper education. Of course, people go in, maybe they're educated in a private school, maybe they're educated in a religious school. There's all kinds, which leads to great diversity. But still, the assumption is by the time they reach the voting age, they've had some kind of education. And that's a law. They have to do that. Not only that, there is already a structure in which they must vote. There's already, there's first of all the Constitution. Then there are, a structure within the federal system, and there's structures within the state system, and even within the local system about who can vote, how they can vote, when they can vote, and so on. So there's already quite a bit of structure. Everybody who's eligible then has the right, and of course, I would disagree with Brennan, and the responsibility to vote. But that puts a big burden, huge burden on the rest of us to encourage that everybody get a proper education. Not necessarily one that favors us individually, but one that is, well, is what I think you said, Joshua. What are the goals of our society? The goals of our society that everybody can find their place based on their aptitude, their knowledge, based on their desire, that they can find a place and find happiness in our society. That is one of the goals that is stated in, the founding of our fathers. So there is already a structure, and we just need to insist that structure be observed and not be tilted. And that I think that diversity be appreciated, as a matter of fact, as well. And that is part of the problem, too, that precincts, sometimes rule certain people in. Why would I vote if I am in a precinct that has no chance of being heard or electing a representative? That's another issue. And so the issues are multi and complicated. I don't think we'll address them all within this hour. But yeah, I would not agree with Brennan. I think that everybody should vote. Everybody's responsibility, and we should encourage everybody to vote and everybody to vote with wisdom and knowledge.
Dan, did you want to jump in? I see you unmuted.
Well, I'm sorry to come in not informed completely, so I'll just ask it. Since I'm not familiar with Brennan or the work, what does Brennan think of the Electoral College, in which we think we're voting for whichever one we're voting for, but in reality we are selecting electors who will themselves vote for president? And I guess the setup has been receiving a lot of attention the last, I don't know, 2 or 3 elections, I suppose. Maybe it goes back farther than that, but because the popular vote would indicate one candidate and the Electoral College would indicate another. And, one of the voice is that is so unjust, but that's the way our Constitution was set up, was it not? And was it not to prevent something like what we're talking about? An irresponsible type of vote or some kind of craziness that goes on. So I'll just leave it for you guys to help me with that.
So I honestly, do you, Steve, do you know, or?
Well, yeah, I would say, I think that I agree with your statement, except for the fact that most of the people we vote for have nothing to do with the Electoral College. So you're obviously talking about just a presidential vote.
Right.
And so I think that where it's true, for the most part, electors do follow, and in some cases, their states require them to follow the popular vote. So I do see that as problematic. I think it's been recognized even by former presidents that the Electoral College obviously was a political evolutionary thing that happened, comes from slavery. And it seems as though we have no way to correct that. I wish it could be, because I do think that there are problems with that, but it may not be quite as bad is what a lot of people make it out to be.
I will say, I don't know, I actually know Brennan's particular position on the actual electoral college, but I can reconstruct, right? His view would essentially be, is this a mechanism that allows us to get more reasonable selectors of either the people who carry out the laws or the laws themselves, right? And so I mean, there's different stories, right? I mean, one, yeah, explicitly is trying to create a compromise, so create some political stability between slaveholding states and free states. But like insofar as this idea here, and this is one that's really, I think, present, especially in the founding of this country, the idea of like, there's this desire on the one hand for expansive democratic rule or Republican rule, and then a real concern about the capabilities of the people, right? And so, you know, when we started, right, most states, I don't know if there's any states that had universal suffrage. There's always like property rights, right? And again, these are mechanisms essentially that look, and I think are understood as epistocratic mechanisms. They're ways of ensuring that who votes is really has the right orientation. One of the arguments was that maybe it's an expertise thing, but if you buy into the literature, if you do, you know, look at the historical stuff, right? One of the concerns is that these people who own land and property and so forth, are folks who are really cultivators and stewards of the nation. So they have like a sort of, it's kind of an aristocratic idea that seems ill placed for democratic thinking. But the idea is like, they have the right values. They're not going to vote merely selfishly. They're going to vote for the good of the whole in some way, right? And so that's the most progressive reading of that policy you can give. But insofar as that's the case, that'd be a reason why the electoral college is like a mechanism for assuring something like that. It's to stop, yeah, you know, mistakes of mobs or masses and so forth. And of course, it also comes out of historical circumstances, right, related to like what the Articles of Confederation years between that and the Constitution. But for Brennan, and the answer to any of these questions is, okay, does this policy give me the outcomes that we should want, which is like reasonable, good, blah, blah, blah. Which again makes it such a slippery target, I think. That's a little frustrating. But I think once we identify, no, there is something valuable, independent of those outcomes, or if that's the position we take, it does make him less slippery, because it's just like, okay, now we have a real thing to disagree on. You have to say, no, it doesn't matter that we have real say. That's a little harder, I think, for him to avoid. I mean, there's other thoughts, but I have a few general questions. So one thing that like ostensibly, and I don't care where the discussion goes, of course, was this idea, okay, compulsory voting in particular. So there's like the more votes versus less votes. Is that a good way to respond to this problem of misinformed or ignorant voters? And then there's the idea of compulsory voting in particular. So we can engage with that. Another thing we might talk about, which we haven't discussed very much today, I don't think, is the idea of how the incentive structure shifts or changes for us if there's more or less people voting, right? And there's some disagreement there, some disagreement that's, you know, based on empirical literature as well. But like, there's both an argument Brennan makes that, you know, more voters is going to give us a perverse incentive to be less informed. And then there's this argument that Shepard alludes to, but a lot of the literature, Du Bois comes to mind for me, is the idea that you have to give people the vote in order to give them the motivation to develop their skills in a certain way. And I've heard this in other ways in this discussion here, like, look, if we don't have the vote, then the reason we need a liberal education falls away, or some of the motivation for that. If we don't have a reason to vote, then my reason to educate myself in certain ways falls away. And so maybe we could talk about the incentive shift in, you know, modern vote. Anyways, I was putting some options on the table to open up wider discussion if folks have thoughts.
Josh, sorry, Steve, I'll just say this really quickly. In terms of like legitimacy, in Greece, we have mandatory voting. And not only that, but there's an option to, and I don't know how, you know, elections work in the US, obviously, but there's an option to cast a blank ballot. And I think that is, in addition to, you know, making it so people can vote more easily, like our voting is on a Sunday. You know, you can, in theory, you know, you have to present a good reason, like you're far from where you vote normally to not vote, things of that nature. But also having that option to cast a blank ballot, I think is really important, because sometimes people just feel so constricted by their choices. They don't like the choices they get. And they would like to have a different option. And in practice, you know, the blank ballot usually doesn't make a difference. But if, say, in an election, you have everyone vote and 70% are blank ballots, and then, you know, someone wins the election with a 16% of the vote majority, that's a big statement about how illegitimate people consider the system, which does not represent their preferences, right? So having, for me, I think, ways to express actually what people's thoughts are about the system, their options, how it works, whether or present to them accurately is important, because now everything is just assumed, right? Maybe people who didn't go didn't care, they didn't bother, they whatever. And so you get a government that's been, voted in by 30% or 40% of eligible voters, probably less than 40. And, it's probably a quarter of the population in general, because a lot of people don't vote, like children. And then, you just have this minority of people dictate everything that happens to everyone else. So I'll just throw that in as a thing that I think is interesting to talk about, that difference.
Well, I agree with that. Keep in mind, they can also write in their candidate, and if they feel like they're disenfranchised, they can write in Pinocchio or Mickey Mouse or something like that if they want to show disdain for the system itself. But they can also write in somebody that they think would, that they would like to see in office. One of the things that was mentioned that I already knew about was what Australia does. It's not against the law to fail to vote. But you do get a discount on your taxes when you do vote. So if you choose not to vote, okay, you pay for it. So it encourages voting without being strictly mandated. I think that's pretty good. However, of course, the weakness is you can still be totally uneducated, and vote, which does, again, dilute maybe the wisest vote. But nonetheless, it lets everybody know that that is their citizen responsibility, I think. And yes, by observing your responsibility, yeah, you get a little discount on your taxes. So go for it.
Yes, Steve.
I have a little less concern about people who might choose not to vote, and more concern about people who are not really able to inform themselves and not able to vote because they're working 2 or 3 jobs, And so to me, I think the bigger issue is social inequality that puts a bigger imbalance between haves and have-nots, and who can, who has real say in a democracy. And I think that's where some of the focus should be. I think similarly, the focus should be on the educational system. And both of those foci, I think, necessitate or underscore that democracy really can only thrive when there's not extreme social inequity. I mean, the two go hand in hand, and they should be synergistic. And anything that undermines social reasonable distribution of wealth, so that people have reasonable opportunity and can therefore reasonably participate in an informed way in a democracy. Anything that undermines that is undermining democracy fundamentally. What I think is interesting is more nuanced discussions about, okay, well, what kind of educational system? Should everyone pay into a public system, or is it in fact good to have competition through a voucher system that potentially takes money from the public school into the private school? I'd like to hear some good arguments about how that doesn't undermine democracy. I'd also like to hear some good arguments about how you sustain and make sure that public education really does support the whole of the electorate, because people are very up in arms about what gets taught in school, and I kind of understand it. I'm not terribly afraid of it, because I think the more ideas you teach and the more you teach people to vet ideas and sort them out, the better. But I know many people feel very disenfranchised by the current form of our democracy, not so much about the Electoral College, but more about how we're educating the next generation. And so that's where I see a big disconnect. It strikes me as odd that we couch the discussion in what system should we have because the current one is not working, as opposed to fix the people so that the system functions better.
Oh, Dr. Dan, go ahead.
Oh, well, thank you for your input there. Despite our best intentions to educate, people tend to resort to opinion leaders to tell them how to vote. And I remember at Alabama, that's where It's where I got my master's. And while I was working on that, at election time, there was some election material that another student had left there. And it said, vote for these candidates, and they were all the same party. And of course, I don't know what I was, 30 or whatever, young guy, and even our professor, who was probably 35 or so, we all looked with disdain, like, why would you not vote for the individual person and their character? And Linda, a classmate who is 55 and very active in her party, said, you're saying that because you're a bunch of unsophisticated voters. And she said, everybody knows you pick a philosophy and you stick with it. And so what I realized then is it does make sense that when people will do that, and the forces out there are people they trust. It may be preachers, because many churches can be very political. I'm extremely careful about that myself, but not as part of our society. So you still, despite our best intentions to inform people from in an objective way, it still, people tend to gravitate toward what they want to do. Other forces are involved in it. So.
I hear you. I don't know why it's necessarily bad, though, to vote a ticket. I mean, you're right, that's a philosophy, but maybe it's an informed philosophy at some level. People will make choices. And it not that what you said falls into this bucket, but there seems to be often an assumption that there was a right outcome, a right vote that a democracy should have gone to or could have gone to if it were just better structured or if people were better informed. And that I bristle at that, because maybe I have too much imposter syndrome, but I don't believe I have the answer for you. And I don't believe I have the answer for Alex. What I do believe is we're part of a community, and we've got to get together and talk and figure it out. And sometimes I'm going to be right, and sometimes I'm going to be wrong, and sometimes I'm going to say things that causes Alex to bristle and vice versa. But I learn a heck of a lot from everyone, and we should be more invested in the society as opposed to the individuals. And so we should embrace that dialogue. And sometimes the outcome of that will be someone votes a party. I don't necessarily see that as bad. It still does put a lot of onus on the individual to think through what their philosophy is, and to decide whether, as you said, they're going to vote on character or they're going to vote on issues. I mean, there could be people with crummy character and good issues, and vice versa. There could be people with great issues and crummy character. Maybe I just said the same thing, but you know what I mean. I think it's up to people to decide what's more important, and recognize in particular that we're thinking about, we have our individual values and our vote reflects that, but we have a society and societal values that are in some way an aggregate. And to get to whatever that epistocratic truth is that the right term? I can't even say it, much less vote on it. But if we want to get to this absolute truth for a society, we've got to be willing to surrender this belief that there is a one thing that we can all know as individuals.
Yeah. Steve, I really like that. I actually want to jump in because it's actually both touching on what you just said there and what you said much earlier about that lawyer guy who's donating both sides. There's this idea. So one reason we might think democracy is important is like literally we're humble, we're reasonable about the fact that I don't know what everybody else wants. And so there's something about the process itself that's going to get it better, right? Rather than the idea that we know what the best outcome is, or maybe we don't, but like somebody knows and we just need to figure out the best way to get there. There's a school of thought that takes us even further, which is particularly popular for deliberative Democrats, but the idea is like the very process of our discussion and conversation. So maybe if we do have a richer debate rather than a polarized one, right? This sort of thing is we actually might change our positions in a way that leads to a more legitimate or justified outcome. And in fact, the idea here is that like sort of the outcome that we want couldn't be determined, couldn't even be identified before the process of discussion, not just because we figure out things, so we get it epistemically, meaning like truth tracking better reasons, but actually that the very process of engagement in conversation and sort of reaching consensus or compromise or whatever produces the ideal outcome. And that's not one that you can like shortcut your way around without the process happening. Sorry, where's gonna go with this? If something like that's the case, one, that gives us an idea for why the procedures are going to be so important. but it also, it makes sense of a sort of, I mean, yeah, I guess it's just another say, sort of value or good of the process itself, independent of whatever outcomes are there. And I think that is another, that's a reason many deliberative Democrats are like, that aristocratic thing, even if it did, yeah, maybe we think Brexit was bad and a different system would have made us avoid Brexit, but then that system would be illegitimate in a way that I think maybe was tracking what Alex says, is normatively objectionable, meaning like it has to do with oughtness, and we're getting things wrong there. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm putting that in there because I was playing mostly Brennan, but it does draw, and this is something that's really important for many thinkers about why. Oh, I missed the key point. Yeah, we don't want to be coerced or oppressed or dominated or blah, blah. And the thought is, yes, I might get the best outcome, but that could some way be a result of me surrendering my autonomy or my power over. So even though Steve picking for me gets me a better meal or something, that might not be the way I want to do it. And actually maybe be objectionable for me to give up my freedom in that way. Whereas, yes, maybe I lose in some sense what I thought was the right position in this process, but this process itself leaves me free in the end, even when the other candidate or the other position comes through, because of how it's undergoing, rather than where we shortcut it with. So I think it's harder to see. Maybe that's a wrong story, and certainly I think Brendan would think it's wrong. But it's harder to see how anything but the process, particularly a fair one, would allow us to get this point where even when I lose, I'm right to go along with it, rather than thinking like, well, yeah, it's better than civil war, or it's better than, you know, whatever. But like, really, there's a freedom I have even getting the wrong, starting with a different position than the position of that one else. Sorry, that was a little jarbled, but. Other final thoughts on this? Yeah. Steve.
So, public school students are assessed at certain grades to see how they're performing. And I think that's a good thing because, you know, they're expected to know the basics, you know, in the language, mathematics, science, government, and so on. And I think that's appropriate. Now, I think Dr. Kubler brings up a good point, though. Private schools are not quite the same. They have a bit more autonomy as how they assess their students. So, you know, maybe if it's part of their education is religious education, maybe they'll get testing on the Bible or something like that, which, you know, certainly can be acceptable. I understand, you know, has actually this group, maybe we're talking about morals and ethics, and certainly there is a brand of ethics that goes along with your religion for sure. But of course, every year there's a fight over the assessment, the type of assessment, what questions are on it, and so on. But at least they are assessed. And here again, that needs to continue regardless of what kind of assessment they have. I worked in Orange County Public Schools for 18 years, I think it is. I was an administrator, though. I did not work. I was not a teacher. I worked in the pupil assignment office and redistricting and presentations to school board members on precincts and all of that. But I did encounter a lot of parents, their students, that wanted transfers because schools are also rated based on those assessments. And it used to be because of the desegregation of in Florida, students had to be assigned based on where their families lived, and you were locked into that. Well, not completely, actually. Then busing came in, and students, if you were in a minority poor achieving school, you could request a transfer to the nearest, you know, let's call it a white school if you were black, and you could also transfer the other way if you wanted to, from a black school, from a white school to a black school. So that was considered equivalent or equal. But nonetheless, there was an attempt to try to give parents more options. I think now they're trying to make all schools optional, which creates all kinds of problems because everybody wants their kid in an A school. Which becomes overcrowded. And when schools grow too big, then there are issues related to how well their students can be educated in very large schools. So this continues, this goes on, but I do think that some kind of assessment is important where parents can get some idea of the level of education that their children are getting and to insist on the best education that they can get. And finally, finally, paying teachers for their dedication and skills, which is a real problem in this state, for sure.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much. So we are a little bit over. I just want to flag that our next meeting and the final one of this term is November 13th. There, we're going to talk a little bit about protest and civil disobedience and non-civil disobedience. Loosely, the idea is election's over. Maybe we're disappointed, but really we want to think about, again, as we've discussed a few times this term, areas or ways in which our democratic participation can be happening outside of that moment where we cast a ballot or run for office or whatever. And so I encourage you all to be there. Thank you so much for coming, Dan. It was wonderful to have you. Hopefully you'll make it in some in the future.
I enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Yeah,
everybody.
Josh, thanks for leading. This
Have a
group.
good day.
Yes.